Hey everybody, it's time once again for another episode of The Art of Photography. My name is Ted Forbes, and today we're continuing on with composition stuff, and we're going to talk about the rule of space. And this is one of my favorites in this rule of series because it's a great way. It's less of a rule, and really in this case I think it's more of a concept, but it's a really great way of creating a little more interest sometimes in an image by adding a little more energy to things, a little more dynamic nature to what's going on, and a little more activity sometimes into an image. And it's very simple. What you're going to do is it's a balance of the subject and negative space. Now, we talked about negative space before, and if you're not sure about that, I'll put a link in the show notes. You can go back and watch that episode. Negative space is just simply space that's very low activity, and maybe this is a background, maybe it's just kind of a lightly blurred texture, maybe it's a flat color, maybe it's just pure black or pure white, something of that nature. And what you want to do is, the rule of space is a way of balancing your subject with this negative space. Now, the rule kind of is stated like this. Let's say you want to create motion in an image, and you're creating an image of a car. You see this a lot in the advertising business if you look at images that were shot for magazines or even sometimes TV ads. But really mainly we're talking about still images. But if you put that car, obviously you could slow down the shutter speed and create a motion blur. That creates activity. But what we're going to do is create motion without necessarily blurring the car out. So really all the rule is you want to put negative space, a good deal of it, in front of the car, so it creates kind of almost a vacuum of where that could be possibly headed to. Okay, and I know this is a little weird and goofy. I think another way of looking at it too is, like, let's say you're shooting a portrait and you want something that's not a flat headshot. You want to open it up a little bit and make it speak a little more than just being something that looks like it would be something in an actor's portfolio or something. You don't want to do a headshot. What you can do is you can take your subject, create a negative space, and simply move their eyes in the direction of that negative space. And what that does is it starts to imply, I think for me, it starts to imply a certain sense of action that's going to be happening, like something is going to go on. Why is that person looking over there? If it's not negative space, if it's filled, it doesn't have the same effect because it's obvious of what they're looking at. But what it does is it creates a little bit of a layer of conclusion that the viewer is going to make up in their own mind. And sometimes that's just very lightweight, sometimes it's more heavy and more involved. But think of it like this. If you look at advertising images a lot, you see somebody looking off at something and then they'll run type over that negative space. Well, that serves the dual purpose because the typography in there is not obstructed by any activity behind it. It's still legible, it's still easy to be read. But it also implies maybe it's a bubble with the person and it's what they're thinking or what they're saying, kind of like a cartoon in a sense. So I know this sounds kind of out there a little bit, and so what we're going to do is let's move over and let's look at some images and really see how negative space is used to create this rule of space, what the following result is. And I want you, like on all these, I say go out and practice this. Go out, get your camera, go grab somebody that doesn't mind you shooting their portrait, and go out and try to get a grasp on this and really let it speak and really learn it and really ingrain it. But anyway, let's come on over and have a look. Okay, so going over to Pinterest this week, I put a board up for rule of space with some images that I've culled out, and we're going to talk through this, and I want to show you some examples of its use. I think, as I'm recording this, this is one of the more difficult concepts to discuss, and I hope I can alleviate that a little bit here. But we've learned about line, shape, positive and negative spaces, figure-ground relationships, all that stuff in the last couple shows that we've done. And I want to show you, just in talking about this technique here, let's open this. This is it's a very well-known image by a photographer named Minor White, and it's an amazing image. Very simple. This is from the Movement Studies. This is number 56, apparently from 1949, and it's just a figure descending a staircase, presumably about to turn that corner. You do have motion blur that sets this into motion, but more important than having that blur, I think you could argue, is it's two things. It is the blur, but also creating that motion is the sense of direction, which is going into, it's not as minimal as negative space is usually defined, but it is a negative space because you can tell it's a doorway on the right-hand side of the image. So you can see that there's a sense of direction that's been implied here, and thus a sense of motion. It gives the image activity, and there is some kind of conclusion that the viewer is probably assembling in their mind looking at this piece. For what it's worth. So anyway, moving along, let me show you how we can look at this in a couple other situations. This is another very famous image by the great Paul Strand. This is the famous Wall Street image. And again, you have motion. At this time, I find this interesting because the negative space you could argue is the upper part of the image above the figures, and the sense of scale. And Wall Street is pretty wild when you look at it in sense of scale because the proportion of humans are so small in comparison. Very high contrast image. You don't see a lot of details in here, particularly with the people, but you make out that they are silhouettes of figures, and they are moving off to the left. And in this case, I mean, it's the sense of perspective that sets this up. It sets up the conclusive desire of looking at this image that people are moving in that direction. It's the sense of perspective more than it is necessarily the negative space, but the negative space is what sets up that sense of perspective. So I think that is important to see in this image. Let's look at it in a slightly different context. This is less landscape oriented, and this is just a simple portrait. This is Imogen Cunningham, a very well-known image of hers, and the fact that you have two figures looking off into what is definitely negative space on the left-hand side of the image. You don't really see the eye direction, but it's implied. And what makes this interesting is that the head in the woman is tilted back, and so it really sets up an interesting definition of what's going on here. Now, we're creating a sense, in this instance, it's not physical motion, but it is a sense of activity in the sense that these people are looking into that negative space. So again, you're drawing a conclusion. It's not necessarily motion in the sense of like moving a car or people walking like in the last two images, but it is a sense of motion with activity in that sense. Another Imogen Cunningham image, I think this one is really amazing. It's got some strange lens artifacts and blurs going on, but again, you have this figure on the left-hand side, high contrast image, and what is essentially negative space with this pond, and the figure is looking down into the pond, presumably female, and you're drawing a conclusion that maybe swimming is about to begin, or there's some relationship between that pond and the person in this image, which I think is amazing. Another great example here, and this is Annie Leibovitz. This is a much more recent image. She's filled the negative space. She's done two things here. She's filled it with the hand of this woman, which is amazing too, with the way the skin's wrinkled, the bone structure, and we have the subject's eyes are closed. And so it is creating that sense of motion, activity, the conclusive nature, but it's put a spin on it because it puts something into that space, in this case the figure, the person's hand, and it's closed the eyes. And I think that this kind of turns the conclusion around, maybe different. And when I say conclusion, I'm not saying that there's a definite story that's being played out every time, and this is why this is kind of hard to explain. We're just talking about visual activity within the image. Viewers may draw their own conclusion as to what's going on. It could be literal, it could be something that's more emotional, it could be something that's less describable. And, I've had interesting feedback with, this is the last of kind of our rule thing for now. I've had interesting feedback with people, on both sides of the coin say, what, I absolutely love this, and other people who are like, I really have a problem with the word rule. And I think it's worth iterating that these are not rules in the sense that they're not recipes. It's not, go out and do this. They're techniques that either have occurred consciously or unconsciously by photographers, and we've looked at some great historical photos in this little part of the series with our rule stuff. And the word rule comes from a scholarly contingent, and they're not rules, they're not recipes, this is not directions of how to set something up. But if you learn how to look at these things, and whether this be, if you go on the Pinterest site even, or you can even look at the composition blog that we're keeping on composition.The or .com. If you go through these, we're analyzing images. We're finding ways of looking at things in an analytical nature. And if you get used to doing that and get used to looking at your own work in an analytical manner, I think that's important, because what you're forcing yourself to do, hopefully, is to ask yourself some questions. And we've talked about that in podcasts before. And maybe sometimes it's not the questions, it's the answers, if you want to get kind of heady about it. But the whole point is to start looking at your work in a different way, to start breaking out of maybe habits that you are subconsciously doing that aren't working visually, and we're using influence of what does work historically, visually, as kind of our catalyst for that. So anyway, all that to say, I just want to clarify that too, because I've had some comments that people are kind of bothered by the word rule on these. And, I am too, and I'm not going to change the titles on the videos because that's what they're known as. So, it's not like a rule is in a law. It's just a rule is in guideline, so to speak. We're going to continue on in the next couple videos with some more composition techniques. We're going to start looking at painting, past master stuff too. This was kind of a big setup to get there. So we're not done with these, but this is the last of kind of, our rule series, so to speak. So anyway, if you guys have any questions or anything, hit me up on email, Pinterest, Twitter, Flickr, Facebook, whatever, and I will, we'll see if we can start a dialogue. So anyway, appreciate everybody for watching. Once again, this has been The Art of Photography, and we'll see you guys next time.